Nowadays, it's not uncommon to hear an African American says that Africans don't like us, or vice versa, to hear a Native African says African Americans don't like us. It's also not uncommon to witness Native Africans arriving in the U.S. with disdain feelings towards African Americans, and also themselves being looked down upon by African Americans. The absolute true reason for this scenario is because both groups are inaccurately perceiving the other through the distorted global media lens of the white society that are benefited when Africans are divided globally. It's all by deliberate design. During the Carter administration, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a national security advisor and political scientist, warned Jimmy Carter and all other Western nations leaders that they had to do everything within their power to prevent Africans that had been spread throughout the diaspora by the European slave trade from uniting with Native Africans politically, culturally, and economically. When Africans are divided globally, we lose our global numerical advantage and we're stripped of all hopes of defeating global white supremacy. Maintaining its global white supremacy by keeping Africans divided globally allows the white society to continue its exploitation of Africans without any global black resistance. The white society's exploitation of Africans has provided it with an era which has flourished most throughout history. To allow this era to end would be directly against the interests of the white society, especially given that the white society's dependence upon Africa's natural resources are indefinite. Therefore, this resulted in white propagandists creating and deploying many propaganda campaigns to divide Africans globally. Here's how white propagandists turned many Native Africans against African Americans. The media images shown to Native Africans of we African Americans are those that depicts African Americans in an unflattering, buffoonery, and culturally disconnected manner. Furthermore, African Americans are made to appear as criminals and thugs, and as being a part of a treacherous, frightening, and almost insane fringe of the society. These images reinforces negative stereotypes about African Americans and produces fear of us within the minds of the Native Africans. It should therefore come as no surprise that many Native Africans develop such a negative opinion about we African Americans. As a result of these media depictions, some Native Africans come to the United States completely looking down upon African Americans, who could very well be their blood relatives. For some Native Africans, the programming against African Americans is so strong that some insist that their children, as they grow up, only marry other Native Africans. Many Native Africans have also given reports of being told by government immigration officials upon arriving in the U.S. to stay clear of African Americans. Now, here's how they've turned many African Americans against Native Africans. I'll tell you a little bit about history a little bit first. During the 1960s, African Americans had begun strongly embracing our African identity. Many started declaring our love for Africa, started wearing afros, braids, dashiki, and giving ourselves African names. African American allegiance towards Africa was very strong during the 1960s. Now, to the contrary, millions of African Americans prefer to be called a nigger than an African. This is all by design. Many literally become angry when they're called an African, and they smile when called a nigger. This profound change within the African American culture is all by design of this propaganda campaign. White social scientists determined during the 1960s that millions of African Americans had developed a romanticized view of Africa. Furthermore, that this romanticized view of Africa fueled the Black Power and Black Pride movement. They also determined that African Americans' allegiance towards Africa hindered the growth of our patriotism toward the U.S. They concluded that in order for African Americans' allegiance toward the U.S. to grow, that our allegiance towards Africa had to be eroded. To meet this objective, White propaganda designers were hired to turn Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for millions of African Americans. They achieved this by constantly inundating African Americans with media images of war-torn, famine-ridden, rapidly literate, and disease-stricken Africa. By only showing the poorest parts of Africa, this manipulates millions of African Americans to feel grateful for the enslavement of our ancestors, because the perception has become that slavery was more of a rescue mission. It rescued us from the backwardness of Africa. This increases Black allegiance towards the U.S. and dissuades us from pursuing the reparations that we're still owed. Some African Americans have been so heavily demoralized and humiliated by the white media's deplorable depiction of Africa that they'll now accept any fable that allows them to claim themselves being anything other than African. This is why so many African Americans have embraced those false, feeble narratives that we're not Africans, although countless of DNA analysis have scientifically confirmed our African identity. We've been scientifically proven as Africans. Psychologists call this disassociation. It's a defense mechanism that evolves to put a distance between themselves and the white society's negative media depictions of Africa that humiliates us. All long-term humiliation and demoralizing psychological warfare campaign leaves damages to their targeted populations. This propaganda campaign also prevents African Americans from pursuing the reparations we are still owed by the U.S. government. This is because, as I said earlier, we've been misled to believe that slavery benefited us. Millions literally perceive it as having been more of a rescue mission. And you hear openly say, I'm glad slavery happened. I'm glad slavery happened. Because we've been made to perceive it as something beneficial. This psychological warfare campaign breaks down African Americans' sense of Black racial heritage and allegiance towards Africa, thus meeting the ruling white elite's global divide and conquer objective. Because as I've stated earlier, when Africans are divided globally, we lose our global numerical advantage and we lose all hope of defeating global white supremacy. To further divide African Americans from Native Africans, white historians also miseducates us to believe that most of our ancestors were sold away and fairly purchased by the white enslavers. This shifting of culpability is intentionally done to create psychological feelings of resentment towards Africans among the African American students. The history of the African slave trade taught to African American students deliberately hides the brutal massacres of countless African warriors that died in battles trying to rescue their captured loved ones from the slave ship. As the African warriors charged the beach, the ship's crew shot cannons, guns, and rifles into their bodies, leaving thousands of blood-soaked Black bodies laying on the beaches. The number of Africans that died in battles fought against the white invaders far exceed many times over the number of Africans that may have assisted in the African slave trade. The hiding of these fierce battles and massacre is deliberately done to perpetuate the lie that most Africans were fairly purchased. To further convey the falsehood that most Africans were sold away, several white artists were hired to create pictures of Africans selling their fellow Africans to the white invaders. We've seen this quite a bit in our books. Reproduction of these drawings and paintings can still be found within America's textbooks, even today. Therefore, every time that an African American students read about the African slave trade, these pictures are placed between the text, subliminally conveying the message that it was your own people that sold you away. It was your own people that wronged you, not the white enslavers. However, critically think and ask yourself this question. If Africans originally owned all the gold, the diamonds, the natural resources, and Western money had no value whatsoever in Africa, and the West had nothing Africans needed, how then was it possible that most of the slaves, the millions of slaves, were fairly purchased? How did they find a way to purchase those millions of slaves? And why wouldn't the greedy white invaders maximize their profits by by exploiting their weaponry advantage of rifles, guns, and cannons to steal, to kidnap most of their slaves. Clearly, most of the enslaved Africans were not fairly purchased. Our core problem is that most of us can't see how our minds are being systematically manipulated to think in ways that serve the white society. It is time to wake up to our reality. It is time to wake up to our reality. One love and peace.